Welcome to the King Institute for Faith and Culture. This morning we welcome Daniel Silliman. He'll be introduced for us by our own Dr. Kyle Osborne. I do want to make a couple of quick announcements as we begin. Immediately after Daniel's lecture this morning, if you want to have some time to talk to him and get some coffee, we're going to go to the Tadlock House. You're very welcome to join us there immediately after the morning lecture. This evening, Daniel will speak again at Central Presbyterian Church. That'll be at 7 p.m. tonight. So I hope you can join us for some of those. November 18th is our final event for the semester. That'll be computer scientist Derek Sherman from Calvin University. Derek's here to talk about AI and faith, something that is occupying a lot of us right now. So please join us for those, but for the moment, I'm going to ask Dr. Osborne to introduce our speaker.
Good morning. Today's talk is about Richard Nixon and Christian faith, and those are two phrases I never thought I would say in the same sentence, apart from a cheap joke in a Quest exam. When I think of Richard Nixon, I think, of course, first about the myriad scandals that plagued his administration. These do not suggest Christian morality and Christian ethics. I do know that he was a Quaker, but I only know this because of his famous campaign slogan of his opponents: "He's not a Quaker, he's a faker." That probably had more punch in 1960 than it has now. And then I've listened to several hours of the Nixon tapes, which are now available on YouTube. We won't get into why. But I do know that he used the word God a lot, just mostly as a prefix for various insults and slurs. So I'm excited about learning the full Richard Nixon, the fuller story today. Dr. Silliman received his Ph.D. from Heidelberg University. He is now the news editor at Christianity Today, and he's an expert on this very subject, the intersection of American politics and Christian faith. He's written a new book on Richard Nixon's personal faith, which I plan to read on my next vacation, right after I cheat on my taxes, lie to my children, and fabricate my yearly self-evaluation. Please welcome Daniel Silliman.
It's good that we've learned all the right lessons this morning. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here again with you on this beautiful campus on this beautiful fall day. Today, I want to talk to you about a vice presidential candidate and his dog. We'll talk about a lot of things along the way: history and the work we do to understand the world, and why we need empathy in our history and need to work on empathy. But I got you out of bed this morning for a story about a man running for vice president and the debate over his dog. I don't know if you know, but there's a whole weird history of the White House and its pets. President Harry Truman once said, "If you want a friend in Washington, get a dog," which is why there's a bunch of dogs in Washington, D.C. named Truman, which I think is funny. And also, Truman didn't have a dog, so it's a little like, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. No thanks, please, I'm fine. But most presidents have had pets, the majority of them. George Washington had 8 foxhounds, coonhounds, and a greyhound, and presidents generally want to be like George Washington. There are a few exceptions. Donald Trump doesn't like dogs and has never had one. Andrew Johnson didn't have a dog. He was from around here. I don't know why he didn't have a dog. He apparently liked mice. He fed the mice at the White House. So sometimes you'll see a list of presidential pets and it'll say Andrew Johnson mice. But they weren't really his, right? They came with the house. Every president has had mice. They're just there. He just fed them. You get into other animals at the White House, and it really starts to get fun. James Madison, parrot. Andrew Jackson, parrot who liked to swear. Thomas Jefferson had a mockingbird named Dick. Teddy Roosevelt, I'm going to keep talking about presidents and pets, so if you just want to buckle in, this is to me, this is important for thinking about empathy. Teddy Roosevelt might have been the best pet president ever. He had a badger, a small black bear, a lizard named Bill, which is a great lizard name, a garter snake named Emily Spinach, plus a pig, a rabbit, a lion that definitely had to be kept away from the pig and the rabbit, and a one-legged rooster. What do you name a one-legged rooster? If you're Teddy Roosevelt, you name it Fierce. That was America. Okay, but the vice presidential candidate and his dog, Richard Nixon and Checkers, that was the dog's name. I want to talk about Nixon and Checkers because I want to talk about empathy and history and how the work of history is empathy. To understand our past and our present, the context of the present, we need to do history. And to do history well, we need empathy. Maybe you don't think you do history. Maybe you're not majoring in history, but you do. You do history. We all do. We do history on a personal level, for example, when we try to understand our parents, those weirdos who raised us. We're doing history when we're analyzing our own decisions, our choices, and thinking about whether they worked out like we wanted. Why did I date that person? Why did I wear this shirt today? Why did I think I wanted to pursue that career? That's all history. We're doing history whenever we look around us and wonder, how did things get this way? Why are things like this instead of something else? Could they be different than they are? We have to think about that if we want to move through life and not bump our shins over and over. And we can be better at it or worse. I suggest better, which means with empathy. Empathy is an incredibly powerful tool for understanding the world. We have this ability to take on the perspective of another person, to feel how they feel and see things as other people experience them. That is amazing that we can do that. We often talk about empathy as a good thing to do, to be kind. Don't be a bully, have some empathy. That's right, of course. I think it's the right way to move through life, with kindness. But don't let the moral argument distract us from the fact that empathy is also incredibly powerful, incredibly useful for understanding the world. It's this heuristic that humans developed to make themselves smarter. Some people do today talk about empathy like it's a kind of weakness. This is an argument that I hear sometimes working for a Christian magazine, that we're not tough enough. I've heard people describe empathy as a kind of poison or toxicity, like you have empathy and it acts as a kind of impairment to your thinking. They say that you can't think straight or can't make tough decisions, the strong choices, because you're too empathetic. You're sensitive, too sensitive, oversensitive. I think that's wrong. The argument that we're having, though, in America is mostly framed as kind versus unkind, or strong versus weak. And I want to add a dimension today: understanding versus not understanding. Empathy is good because it makes you kind, but it's also good because it makes you not stupid. It's good because it helps you understand other people in the world. You can decide what to do with your understanding once you understand, but first you have to understand. Okay, the history. Nixon is chosen as the Republican vice presidential candidate in 1952. He's going to be the number 2 guy for General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a military general who led the Allies, America, and all the Allies in World War II. He's the guy, if there's one guy, who defeated the Nazis in Germany. The Normandy landing, D-Day, Omaha Beach, you know his work. He's an American hero, and he's running for president as a Republican in 1952, and he chooses Richard Nixon for his vice president. Nixon is incredibly young. He's just 39 at the time, the youngest vice presidential candidate ever at that time. He's been a congressman, though, and a senator, and he's earned a reputation as a strong conservative, a fighter. And Eisenhower picks him. Great, good. Eisenhower's plan is to run on the idea that this is a crusade. He's been on a crusade in Europe to save Europe from Nazis. Now he's on a crusade in America to clean up government. Before him, there was Harry Truman, President Harry Truman, the guy who didn't have a dog. And there were lots of concerns about the integrity of the government under Truman and the Democrats. One of Truman's aides liked to accept gifts, like once he got 8 deep freezers from a company that made deep freezers and wanted to do a lot of government work with the government. There were at least 160 people in Truman's executive branch who took bribes, stole money, stuff like that. Which is too many, 160. I don't know what your limit is, but mine's definitely below 160. So Eisenhower is running on cleaning things up and being squeaky clean. And he picks Nixon, a good guy, a young guy, known for being a Quaker, very serious, squeaky. Except Nixon has accepted money from political donors who put it in a fund for him, a political fund. And right as he starts campaigning for VP, there's a newspaper report about this fund. It's not clear if he's done anything wrong in accepting this money, if this is unethical or criminal or both, but it doesn't look good. He's on a train, which is how people campaigned in those days, on a whistle-stop tour, going from Southern California, where he grew up, to Portland, up the coast to Portland, Oregon. And every town they stop, and Nixon goes to the back of the train, and a bunch of people gather around, and he gives a speech. Who can clean up this mess in Washington? Ike can. We like Ike. They called Eisenhower Ike. We like Ike. Eisenhower, by the way, had a Weimaraner dog and a parakeet. Every town, Nixon stops, gets at the back, gives his speech, then goes back on the train. They go to the next town. The train is called the Dick Nixon Special, which, if you imagine growing up poor in a little town, and then in your 30s, you go back to that town and they name a train after you. Another town, another stop, another speech. Who likes Ike? And of course, this is the old days, so no cell phones, and they also don't do landlines on trains. So they go from town to town, and between the towns, they have no news. But they start hearing that there's a scandal brewing, something with this fund, a fund crisis. It starts with a few questions from reporters for the campaign staff. What's this about a fund? But the staff doesn't actually know. And it's pretty vague. But a newspaper in the East, the New York Post, has a blaring headline, "Secret Nixon Fund!" exclamation mark. And the subhead says something about rich businessmen paying Nixon. What are they paying him for? Why is it a secret? What is the fund doing now? Doesn't seem so squeaky. By the second day of this train trip, Democrats are starting to come to Nixon's whistle-stop events to heckle him and shout out things like, "What about the money?" And Nixon tries to say that all of this is unfair. It's a baseless attack. But that would have worked better if he could say it was actually all untrue. And it wasn't, not quite. The fund wasn't secret, but there was a fund. And that gets a little hard to explain. Nuance is not your friend in presidential politics. They have a saying, if you're explaining, you're losing, which is someone who explains stuff professionally for a living is a little odd, but there you go. At the train stops, staff members start to run to payphones to try to call across the country to talk to the staff members and Eisenhower's team, who are also incidentally on a train going across the country with no telephones. So the math of the communication is amazingly difficult. You got to get from one train stop to another train stop, get them stopped at the train time, and connect at that moment. It's like one of those horrible math problems, right? Candidate A, 45 miles an hour. Candidate B, having a fund crisis. They never do connect. Nixon's people wanted Eisenhower's people to tell them how to respond, come up with a strategy to fight the attack, do a coordinated maneuver. Instead, Eisenhower ends up making a statement to the media without ever talking to Nixon's people. And his statement doesn't actually defend his vice presidential candidate. Instead, he just says, sort of vaguely, that everyone in his White House will be as clean as a hound's tooth, which what does that mean? Like, is he saying that Nixon isn't clean as a hound's tooth, or that he's going to check Nixon to see if he's clean as a hound's tooth? Also, how clean are hound's tooths? This is a saying that doesn't totally make sense. I don't know. It's really not clear to anyone what it means. And what's happening behind the scene, as I write about in my book, is that Eisenhower and his advisors actually want to get rid of Nixon, but they don't want to do it. They want him to volunteer to quit. If they fire him, it'll look disloyal to him and to his people. The many people who like him will feel betrayed because he betrayed Nixon. Plus, they have no idea if the fund is actually a problem, if he did anything wrong, or it's just innuendo and slander, a political attack. So they don't want to do the deed and push him out, but they don't want the headache either, so they would like Nixon to push himself out, please. First, they leave him hanging and hope he gets the hint. Then they hint a little more directly. Finally, they just have someone say it, you should drop out. But Nixon won't. He has another plan. He comes up with another plan, which involves his dog. He goes to LA, goes to a TV studio and books some time and gives a speech. He decides he's going to lay out his finances, give an accounting of his life and his morality, his money in this fund, and then ask the American people to decide. Should he stay on the campaign? Is he clean enough like a hound's tooth? No one had ever done this before, and in some ways it was crazy, but Nixon was going to do it. He took a spot on the reality TV of the time, though they didn't call it that, and adapted it. NBC had a show called the Original Amateur Hour, where people would come on, kind of like American Idol, and perform something, singing or dancing or juggling, baton twirling, which I guess was a big thing in the 50s. One time there was a group that played harmonicas with fire extinguishers. This does not exist on YouTube. I have looked for a while. I'd really like to see that. But they do these weird acts, the amateur hour, and then viewers would call in and vote, or write in and vote, and then the next week they would decide who got to go on to the next round or something like that. So Nixon decides to do almost the same thing on NBC, in that same studio. He's going to do his performance and ask people to call in, write in, and say if he should stay on the campaign or not. And he gets the dog to be part of it too. September 23, 1952, he goes on TV and talks about his finances, opens up his bank account, basically. He talks about the fund. It was $18,000 from donors that he used for political purposes, to send out mailers and pay for campaign trips and things like that. He hadn't taken any money for himself. He didn't have direct access to the fund. He could just turn in receipts and get reimbursed. And he also showed his own finances, what he had sort of made, which was not out of line with what other poor congressmen had made. He talked about what he owned: a 2-year-old car, a life insurance policy, a house, well, really the bank owned it, and also a dog. He said he hadn't accepted any gifts, no deep freezers or anything like this, but he had accepted a dog, a Cocker Spaniel from a supporter in Texas, and the kids loved the dog, Little Puppy, and they named it Checkers. Nixon said, regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep that dog. People thought this was incredibly corny. Or worse, it was just embarrassing and gauche. Like today, I think we would say he was being a tryhard. It just seems so desperate to be willing to humiliate himself on what they didn't yet know to call reality TV, and talk about money and debt, and then the dog thing. It seems so obviously manipulative. One commentator at the time said it was the most demeaning thing he had ever seen in American politics, and maybe American public life generally. Another said it was a grotesque performance where, quote, Dick Nixon stripped himself naked for all the world to see, and he brought his missus and the kids and the dog into the act. I blushed. But maybe Americans are a little corny. We like dogs. We like animals. We like it when there are pets in the White House. You know, on second thought, I'm going to go with Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, best pet president in American history. Teddy Roosevelt was pretty good, but Coolidge had so many dogs. I think he had more dogs than most other presidents combined. He also had donkeys, ducks, songbirds, a raccoon named Rebecca, which is just amazing, and an antelope at the White House. Also a goose, a bobcat, wallaby. He had a hippopotamus named William Johnson Hippopotamus, which is just an exquisite hippopotamus name. When was America great? Why don't you ask William Johnson Hippopotamus? All right, Nixon. Nixon gives this speech, which is called the Checkers speech today, after the dog. And these professional commentators were appalled. But lots and lots of regular Americans responded really positively. They called into the TV station, called Eisenhower, called Republican National Headquarters, any place they could think to call. And they wrote piles and piles of postcards and letters, and they said, keep Nixon. If you go to the Nixon archives in Southern California, like I did to research my book, you can read these. They're all in files, and it goes on and on. Some of them are long, passionate letters about how hard it is to make it in America, hard work and virtue, and what Nixon means to average Americans. And some of them just say, keep Nixon, which Eisenhower did. That was a critical turning point in the campaign and in Nixon's whole career, which means it was also a critical turning point in contemporary American history. Everything Nixon did after that, he couldn't have done if he hadn't survived the fun speech with the Checkers speech, the fun crisis with the Checkers speech. And you can still see the ripples of this in American politics, too. Every time someone tries to save their political career with one big speech, that's partly because of Nixon and his dog. Because this moment was so important, and because it was so dramatic, people have tried to understand what happened. They've sort of bumped their shins on this speech. How do you understand this event? In some ways, it's a debate about empathy. The question is whether Nixon's appeal to the American people was cynical and manipulative. You can tell the story so it's about the new power of television, even reality television, how it affects our emotions. Nixon knew how to manipulate emotions, and so he brings up the dog because who doesn't love a dog? And that's, in a way, illegitimate, people argue, because it's emotional instead of rational, an appeal to sentiment and sentimentality. But it works. And that signals something about the future of American politics, the political dangers coming up, where masses of people can be rallied by powerful speeches and cute dogs and men who have an intuitive grasp on how to use the media. I think this argument misses some things. One, it assumes that this is new and analyzes the speech as if it needs to be explained as something new, a politician winning support by talking about a dog. But it's not unprecedented. It's actually incredibly precedented. Franklin Roosevelt had a dog that he kept with him all through World War II, traveled the world with him, shows up actually in some of the historical photos in the background or under Roosevelt's seat. Roosevelt named his dog Murray the Outlaw of Falla Hill, but they called him Falla. And FDR actually gave a speech about his dog in the presidential campaign of 1944, making fun of Republicans for not liking his dog, and the speech killed. But even further back than that, James Garfield had a dog in the White House, a Newfoundland, and made it an explicitly political act, a political message, by naming his dog Vito. Just a message to Congress in the form of a very good boy. Coolidge, incidentally, who I've already said is the best pet president, had a lion cub, and he named it Tax Reduction. Okay, but the point is that one of the problems of not knowing history, not knowing what happened before, is you misunderstand the world in front of you. You think that stuff hasn't happened, and that makes you think about what has happened in a particular way. History is helpful, giving you a sense of context and some perspective. But there's another problem with this standard interpretation of the Checker speech. It's completely incurious about why Nixon did what he did and his experience, how he experienced the fun crisis. Problem number two is it lacks empathy. People don't generally think they need to be empathetic towards Richard Nixon, which I get. He's incredibly powerful, after all, major figure in American politics. And his decisions have had a dramatic impact on this nation and around the globe. Many of those decisions, very bad decisions. He ends his presidency in great failure, calamity, catastrophe, and there are real consequences. This is not normally the moment when we tell each other collectively, remember to be kind. Kindness is important. With Nixon, with a powerful person who is messed up, judgment is important. We want to say clearly and forcefully what went wrong, and that it was wrong. I agree with that. But I'm arguing that empathy is not just for kindness, as good as kindness is. Empathy is for understanding. It's this powerful tool that we have to be better at understanding the world, our history, ourselves, why things are the way they are. If we're willing to look at the fund crisis with empathy, we go back to the story and ask about Nixon's experience. How did he experience this series of events? Well, he's 39, the youngest vice presidential candidate in history. He's picked by Eisenhower, the general who won World War II. And this is an incredible honor. He gets on a train to campaign, the train named after him, starting in his hometown. Imagine how that would feel. Everyone you know from your childhood gathering to applaud and cheer as you set off on a journey to clean up the government, this special occasion. Then there's a headline, an attack, and it's not entirely wrong, but it's not right either. It frames things in a particular way to make them seem worse than they are. Some important details are incorrect, and the story is built on an implication rather than a fact. But of course, when you try to give an account, you're caught up in it, and the scandal consumes you. It's incredibly upsetting and feels deeply unfair. Nixon notes, not incorrectly, that other people have done much worse things than he did. The vice presidential candidate on the Democratic side, his opposite in the race, was a senator who gave his wife a make-work job in his office, putting her on the public payroll even though she didn't work for the government, sort of basic graft. But no one really seems to care. And it's kind of a icky argument. Other people did this bad thing worse. So Nixon turns to Eisenhower for help. He wants the man who picked him to make a statement and clear his name. Eisenhower has the authority, the prestige, and he could look at the facts and say something, make a statement, pronounce Nixon clean. Clean as a houndstooth, squeaky, good. But Eisenhower refuses. He has his political capital, and he's not going to use it this way. The VP is supposed to, after all, help the P win elections. The P is not supposed to spend his time rescuing the VP. So how does Nixon feel? What is it like for him? He feels betrayed. Deeply betrayed by someone he thought of, honestly, as a father figure, both to him and the country. He feels ashamed. He's being publicly humiliated, mocked, and people are given essentially carte blanche permission to make fun of him and malign his character, taking this money, whatever the technical legality. He also feels alone. He's left to deal with this completely by himself. That's the context in which Nixon turns to the public and creates the spectacle with reality TV, brings his dog into it, and wins the support of the audience. He turns to the public in this personal crisis, and maybe it's fair to see that as manipulation. But if you want to understand what he is doing, you have to understand how he felt. He felt bad, he felt ashamed, he felt alone, he felt like he wasn't okay. And when the people who were supposed to affirm him didn't, he went looking in another place. In fact, as I show in the book, you can chart Nixon's career by looking at the different ways he tried to deal with shame. As a Christian, I believe that God loved Richard Nixon, but Nixon couldn't receive it, couldn't accept it. Like so many of us, actually, he didn't feel God's love. So he looked for approval from his parents, who were broken people. And then he seeks the approval of party leaders, Republican officials, prominent men in public life. And that doesn't work and leads to the fund crisis. It gives him this moment of sort of incredible psychological disaster. And that's when he turns to the public and gives the checker speech. And it works to win over crowds. But then it doesn't work. He loses when he runs for president himself in 60. And then he runs again and wins in 68, but it doesn't feel like it means anything. And he needs it to mean something, even though there are these extenuating circumstances that explain his win in some other way. That's actually the context, the same narrative arc at which he turns to secret taping system, which he sets up in the White House to record everything he does. He has this idea that this will be the thing that affirms him, not the public, not the political leaders, not his parents, not God, but this kind of artificial judgment throne that he set up for himself. The tapes will render the true verdict on who Richard Nixon is. The irony, of course, is that is true. The tapes record his criminal behavior, attempts to obstruct justice, and they lead to the end of his presidency, the greatest shame of his life, coming from his strategy to not feel shame. If you want a friend in Washington, they said, get a dog. And if you're Nixon, then use the dog in a major speech to win over public support at a critical point in your political career. Then realize that the public is not reliable, and you can't depend on them for your evaluation of your own worth. So install a secret taping system to listen. History would have been different if Nixon had stopped with the dog. He actually did get another dog when he was in the White House. As president, he got an Irish setter named King Timoho, and the dog didn't like him. Nixon had to try to bribe the dog to sit by him, had to keep treats in his desk to try and lure the dog over. It was pretty embarrassing to everyone involved. It was so obvious this dog was a judge of character and did not like Richard Nixon. Probably the dog was right. I'm not here to tell you that King Timoho was not a good judge of character. I'm not saying that you should like Nixon or think that he's a good person. You don't need to like him because he deserves your kindness. You really don't need to do anything. He really didn't do anything, after all, to earn your likeness, and quite a few things in his life to reject it. But if you can think about how he felt, how he experienced this pivotal episode in his life, which became a pivotal episode in American history, then you can understand why he did what he did. You can see more clearly what is happening, why it happened, and what would happen next. Empathy is powerful. So this is what I want to say. When you do history in your own life, whether you are trying to understand a president's relationship to dogs, or understand your own life, your decisions, your parents and their decisions, don't forget that you have this tool. It doesn't make you weak to use empathy. It's not toxic. It's not addling your brain or limiting your rationality. It's powerful. It's incredibly powerful. But it does take work. The work of history is the work of empathy. My advice is to go work like a dog. Thank you.